This really is a high point, spiritually speaking, I think, in the history of Israel. They have, I used the expression just a little bit ago, they have arrived. They've got now a king with a permanent palace, a king who is Solomon marrying the daughter of Pharaoh, right up there with the other great kings of the world. They have a God who now will be recognized as surely one of the great gods even by pagan nations, because this great temple has been built in his honor there. And they would look at that temple and the magnificence of that temple and say, we have arrived. But you know, that's going to be a dangerous situation to be in. I say this is as good as it's ever got. From here on is all downhill. And I think we might know something about that ourselves. I've known many times over the years of congregations that people really worked hard when they were just getting started, meeting first in somebody's home, and then they maybe move into a storefront, and then maybe they've got a little small building, and at first they've got just doing the preaching among themselves, and then somebody's going to preach part-time, and finally they reach the point where they have their own building, and it's bought and paid for, and they've got their own full-time preacher, and they've got elders, and it's we have arrived. And a lot of times that's as good as it ever gets. It's like we have arrived. All of the work and the energy that went into reaching that point, everybody kind of sits back and says, okay, we'll turn it over to the elders and the preacher now, and we're just the members. And everything's supposed to just kind of coast along on even plane. And in fact, what really happens, not obviously at first, but as things start to go downhill. And I think that's basically what happened to the children of Israel right here. They felt like they'd arrived. But by the end of the reign of Solomon, problems had already started to develop. Solomon himself had gone and served other gods. The nation divided into two and was plagued by civil war. And the next 200 years tell the story of intermittent civil war between the northern and southern kingdom, and finally the northern kingdom of Israel is carried away captive. The southern kingdom of Judah would last a little over 100 years more, and finally they too became so wicked that God was determined to destroy them. And the wickedness that they kept returning to over and over again, despite all the warnings from all the prophets that God sent, was they kept going to serve other gods. I'm sure they had many other sins that they were corrupted by as well, but they kept going to serve other gods. There were times that they even set up altars to other gods in the very temple that had been built for God himself. And God had been long-suffering with them. God might well have destroyed his temple at the end of the reign of Solomon because Solomon himself went and served other gods. But God had been long-suffering with them through hundreds of years. Through good kings and bad kings, God had delivered them even when they had bad kings at times. But they persisted in their rebellion against him to the point that God finally said, I can't stand it anymore. And they're not going to turn back to me no matter what. If I punish them, they're not going to turn back to me. If I bless them, they're not going to turn back to me. There's no point staying here. And so God brought about the destruction of the city of Jerusalem, of the temple, just as he had said he would do. And I'm not going to turn and read it right now, but if you wanted to turn to 2 Kings chapter 25, you can read in very laconic style, very sobering sort of blow-by-blow description about how the city was taken by Nebuchadnezzar and the Babylonians, and how first the walls was breached, and then later the king tried to escape and he was caught, and then they came in and they burned the palace and they pulled down the walls and they burned the temple. But what I find really interesting is the description of what happened that is given to us by the prophet Ezekiel. I'd like for you to turn to Ezekiel chapter 10. Ezekiel was one of several prophets that God sent to the nation at the time this destruction came. He sent Jeremiah, who was there with most of the Jews in Jerusalem during all of this time. Ezekiel was actually working primarily with the Jews who had already been taken captive to Babylon. But in both cases, the prophets were dealing with people who didn't want to accept the fact that God was really going to destroy his house, who said, the temple of the Lord is here. We're safe. We're secure. God's surely not going to destroy his house. And they kept saying, oh, yes, he is. And the prophet Ezekiel had what is to me the most interesting way to describe it in light of what we've been looking at. Remember when they built the tabernacle, the glory of the Lord moved in. You remember when they built the temple to replace the tabernacle, the glory of the Lord moved in. Well, in Ezekiel chapters 10 and 11, Ezekiel is going to see a vision. He's going to be in Babylon, but the Lord is going to transport him in the Spirit back to Jerusalem, where he's going to see a vision of a chariot of cherubim descend from the heavens in the vision. And the glory of the Lord is going to come out of the temple. It's going to get up into that chariot, and it's going to head back up to heaven. The glory of the Lord is going to leave. God's going to move out. In Ezekiel chapter 10, picking up here, 10th chapter of Ezekiel, picking up in the 4th verse, he says, "Then the glory of the Lord went up from the cherub to the threshold of the temple. And the temple was filled with a cloud, and the court was filled with the brightness of the glory of the Lord." It's kind of like the Lord's one last looking around, and the radiance of His glory is illuminating everything there in the courtyard and even in the temple itself. But God can't stay there any longer, because God is holy, and this nation has persisted in their sinful corruption of themselves and His dwelling place among them. And so, if you'll come on down to the 18th verse of this same 10th chapter, it says, "Then the glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood over the cherubim." The cherubim were this cherubim chariot. Ezekiel had seen this cherubim chariot back in the very first chapter. And it has reappeared now. And it's come to get the Lord. And it says, "The glory of the Lord departed from the threshold of the temple and stood up over the cherubim. And when the cherubim departed, they lifted their wings and rose up from the earth in my sight, with the wheels beside them. And they stood still at the entrance of the east gate of the Lord's house, and the glory of the God of Israel hovered over them." So from the threshold to up on the chariot, now the chariot moves up over the east gate. That was the main entryway on the east side to the city and to the temple area. But he waits there a little bit longer. It's almost like God keeps pausing and waiting. And narrated in between are still other atrocities that are being committed, even as God is in the process of very slowly departing. So finally you get down to the 11th chapter. If you come down to the end of the 11th chapter in verse 22, it says, "Then the cherubim lifted up their wings with the wheels beside them, and the glory of the God of Israel hovered over them. And the glory of the Lord went up from the midst of the city and stood over the mountain which is east of the city," Mount of Olives as we usually call it. "And the Spirit lifted me up and brought me in a vision by the Spirit of God to the exiles in Chaldea. So the vision that I had seen left me. And I told the exiles all the things the Lord had shown me." Went back and told them, "I was taken to Jerusalem in a vision. And guess what? The Lord has abandoned us. He's moved out. His house is empty." And of course, once the glory of the Lord removed itself, that house was just like any other house. It enjoyed no special status, no special protection. And within weeks after that vision, it was destroyed, as we read about in 2 Kings chapter 25. You know, at this point, this really is the low point of the history of Israel in the Old Testament. They have persisted in their sin to the point that God basically destroyed their country. He took away their king. He removed Himself from His being present among them. He took them away from their land and sent them off to the land of Babylon. Everything that was precious to them, everything that was sort of their self-identity or who there was, He took it all away from them, stripped it all away from them, and sent them off to the land of Babylon. If ever there was a time where it looked like sort of this grand experiment failed, this is it. Can God and man dwell together? Looks like the answer is no. It looks like God's great effort to reconcile man back to Himself, that had begun with that promise to Abraham back there, has come to nothing. God had tried, but man just wouldn't cooperate. It looked like basically there was no hope. A great idea, nice idea, good experiment, but time to give up on it. And perhaps many did give up on it. But the fact is, that promise that God had made to Abraham was not conditional. It didn't depend on the faithfulness of man, but for our benefit, it depended only on God's faithfulness. Man had failed, but God was not going to fail. And in the midst of that captivity, those very same prophets, like Ezekiel and Jeremiah, that had been hammering away at the people, God is going to destroy this temple, He is going to leave, He is not going to put up with this. Once God had destroyed the temple and taken them into captivity, those very same prophets began to say, but God will still keep His promise. And God will still have His people, and He will still dwell among His people. Look over to Ezekiel chapter 37. In the 37th chapter of the book of Ezekiel, picking up about verse 24, the prophet looks forward to a new day that is going to come. A new day when they will have come back from this captivity, and God will have restored them and brought them back to their land. And when God will send David to be their king, and of course, knowing the full story of the Bible, we know who this David is, that it's the coming of Jesus he's talking about. He says, and my servant David will be king over them, and they will all have one shepherd. And they will walk in my ordinances and keep my statutes and observe them. And then down in verse 26 he says, and I will make a covenant of peace with them. This is exactly what Jeremiah calls the new covenant. He says, I will make a covenant of peace with them, and it will be an everlasting covenant. And I will place them and multiply them, and I will set my sanctuary in their midst forever. My dwelling place also will be with them, and I will be their God, and they will be my people. And the nations will know that I am the Lord who sanctifies Israel, when my sanctuary is in their midst forever. He says, I'm still going to have my people, my Israel, and I'm going to dwell among them. Well, how's that going to work out? Later on, Ezekiel even describes the whole last several chapters of the book of Ezekiel, chapters 40 through 48. I'm not going to look at those in detail now. But that whole last 8 chapters of the book of Ezekiel is devoted to a vision Ezekiel saw of a new temple that God will build. And in the 43rd chapter, he even describes a vision of that cherubim chariot coming back down with the glory of the Lord. And the glory of the Lord would fill that temple that God would someday have. Well, what happened? Historically, what happened?